Tonight's story takes us back to 1895, inside the mansion that hid something nobody in the family ever admitted. The rain fell in sheets against the leaded glass windows of Thornfield Hall, each droplet tracing crooked paths down panes that would soon witness decades of silence. In the drawing room, Edmund Whitmore held the architect's final plans with hands that barely trembled. His wife, Margaret, sat rigid in her chair, her needlework forgotten in her lap. Between them lay an unspoken agreement, a conspiracy of stone and mortar that would entomb their greatest shame. The blueprints showed everything: the grand entrance hall with its sweeping staircase, the conservatory that would catch the morning sun, the library with shelves built to hold 1,000 volumes. But it was the small amendment in the west wing that held their attention. A room without windows. A room with walls twice the standard thickness. A room that would never appear on any tour, never be mentioned at any dinner party, never exist in any conversation beyond these walls. "The builders begin tomorrow," Edmund said, his voice carrying the weight of industrial authority that had built his fortune. Outside, thunder rolled across the Yorkshire moors, and somewhere in the east wing of their current residence, a door creaked, a sound that made Margaret's fingers tighten on her embroidery hoop until her knuckles went white. They had told everyone that Isabel had gone to Switzerland for her health. A private sanatorium in the Alps, they said, where the clean air and modern treatments would restore their daughter's delicate constitution. The lie had been surprisingly easy to maintain. After all, wealthy families often sent their troubled children abroad. Nobody questioned it. Nobody except the servants, who knew that the trays of food carried to the east wing never left the property, who heard the singing that drifted through the walls on quiet nights, who learned to avert their eyes when passing certain doors. The Whitmore fortune had been built on cotton mills and coal mines, enterprises that Edmund had inherited from his father and expanded with ruthless efficiency. By 1894, the family name was synonymous with northern England's industrial might. Their current manor house, Whitmore Lodge, had served them well for 3 generations, but Edmund had grander visions. He wanted a monument to the family's success, a residence that would announce their arrival among England's true elite. The new mansion would have 42 rooms, each more opulent than the last. Italian marble would line the entrance hall. French tapestries would adorn the walls. The finest craftsmen from London had been commissioned for the woodwork. No expense was spared, for this house would be perfect, a gleaming jewel set against the harsh moorland landscape. But perfection, Edmund had learned, often required concealment. The plans had been drawn and redrawn throughout the spring of 1894. The architect, Mr. Jonathan Pemberton, was a man of impeccable reputation who had designed homes for dukes and industrial barons alike. When Edmund had approached him with the special requirements for the West Wing, Pemberton had raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. An additional fee had ensured his discretion. "You understand," Edmund had said during their private meeting, "that this particular room requires special consideration. My wife's nephew suffers from a nervous condition. We wish to provide him with a quiet space for his recovery, away from the noise and bustle of the household." Pemberton had nodded, making notes about reinforced walls and acoustic insulation, new techniques borrowed from modern hospital design. If he wondered why a room for a visiting nephew required a concealed entrance and no windows, he kept such thoughts to himself. The Whitmore money spent as well as anyone's. Margaret Whitmore had not always been the brittle woman who now presided over tea services with mechanical precision. Once, she'd been Margaret Ashford, the daughter of a respected barrister, known for her wit and her watercolor paintings of botanical subjects. She had married Edmund for love, or something close enough to it, and for 19 years had played her role as the industrial baron's wife with grace. But that was before Isabel's troubles began. It started with small things in the autumn of 1893. Isabel, always a sensitive child given to flights of fancy, began to speak of voices in the walls. She claimed the mirrors showed faces that weren't there. She would spend hours arranging and rearranging objects in her room, insisting that they had to be placed in exact patterns to keep the bad thoughts quiet. At first, Margaret attributed it to the stress of the social season. Isabel was 19, the age when young women of their class were expected to shine at balls and attract suitable husbands. But Isabel had always been different. Too intelligent, too questioning, too willing to speak her mind on subjects young ladies shouldn't contemplate. Perhaps the pressure of conforming to society's expectations had overwhelmed her delicate nature. The family physician, Dr. Hartwell, had prescribed rest and tonics. When those failed to help, he recommended specialists in London. Edmund had taken Isabel to Harley Street, where learned men in dark suits had examined her and spoken in hushed tones about hereditary nervousness and female hysteria. Their treatments, ice baths, restraints, medications that left Isabel glassy-eyed and trembling, had only made things worse. By Christmas of 1893, Isabel's condition had deteriorated dramatically. She would go days without sleeping, pacing her room and writing frantic letters to people who didn't exist. She became convinced that the servants were poisoning her food, that her parents were impostors, that the house itself was alive and malevolent. During her lucid moments, she would weep and beg for forgiveness for things she couldn't name. The breaking point came on New Year's Eve, when Isabel had appeared at the top of the stairs during the family's annual gathering, dressed only in her nightgown, screaming about fires that only she could see. The guests, business associates and their wives, the local magistrate, the vicar, had stood frozen as Edmund and 2 footmen had carried her back to her room. The scandal had been contained, barely, with talk of sudden illness and concerned murmurs about the delicate Whitmore daughter. But Edmund knew the truth. They were one incident away from social ruin. The conversation that sealed Isabel's fate took place in Edmund's study on a cold January morning in 1894. Dr. Hartwell sat across from the desk, his medical bag at his feet, his face grave. Margaret was not present. Edmund had decided this was a matter requiring masculine resolve. "I'm afraid, Mr. Whitmore, that your daughter's condition is beyond my expertise," Dr. Hartwell said. "In my professional opinion, she requires institutional care." Edmund had visited such institutions. He had seen the barred windows, the restraint chairs, the patients who howled like animals in their cells. He had smelled the carbolic acid that couldn't quite mask the stench of human misery. The thought of Isabel in such a place was unbearable. "There must be another way," he said. Dr. Hartwell shifted uncomfortably. "There are private arrangements that some families make. It's not strictly legal, you understand, but for a family of means—" "Go on." "The patient could be cared for at home in a controlled environment. It would require absolute discretion from the staff and regular medical supervision. The authorities need never know." Edmund leaned back in his leather chair, considering. "And if we were to build a new residence, one with appropriate facilities?" The doctor's eyes lit with understanding. "That would be ideal. A room designed specifically for her needs, away from the main household. I could make recommendations for the construction." They shook hands on it, 2 gentlemen agreeing to a conspiracy of compassion. Or so Edmund told himself. The servants of Whitmore Lodge had long practiced the art of selective blindness. In grand houses across England, the help saw everything and said nothing, their livelihoods depending on their discretion. But Isabel's situation tested even their well-trained silence. Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, was the first to be brought into the circle of knowledge. A widow of 50 with iron-gray hair and a face that rarely betrayed emotion, she had served the Whitmores for 20 years. When Edmund explained the new arrangements, she had simply nodded and asked about dietary requirements. It was Mrs. Davies who selected the most trustworthy staff for what became known as special duties. Young Thomas, the 2nd footman, whose own sister had been touched by madness. Sarah, the upstairs maid, whose quiet manner and steady hands made her ideal for difficult tasks. Old George, the groundskeeper, who had seen enough of the world to know that sometimes kindness meant keeping secrets. They developed a routine with military precision. Meals were prepared in the main kitchen, but taken to a small warming kitchen near the east wing. From there, Thomas would carry the trays to Isabel's rooms, a suite that had been modified with locks on the windows and padding on the walls. The door was kept locked from the outside, opened only for meals and medical visits. Sarah would enter twice a week to clean, always accompanied by Thomas. She would find the rooms in various states of disarray, books torn apart, furniture overturned, sometimes messages scrawled on the walls in charcoal or worse. Isabel would sometimes rage at them, sometimes plead, sometimes sit in eerie silence, watching them work with eyes that seemed to see through the walls. The hardest times were when Isabel was lucid. She would speak to Sarah in her old voice, asking about the weather, inquiring after the health of other servants, requesting particular books from the library. Once she had pressed a letter into Sarah's hands, addressed to a school friend, full of normal gossip and observations about fashion. Sarah had given it to Mrs. Davies, who had given it to Edmund, who had burned it in his study fireplace. The other servants, those not brought into the secret, whispered among themselves. They heard the cries that echoed through the walls at night. They noticed the extra washing, the special purchases from the chemist, the way certain members of staff would emerge from the East Wing with haunted expressions. But they knew better than to ask questions. Jobs were scarce, and the Whitmores paid well for silence. Construction on Thornfield Hall began in the spring of 1894. Edmund threw himself into the project with the same determination that had built his business empire. He was on site daily, overseeing every detail, driving the workers with bonuses for speed and threats for shoddy work. The mansion rose from the moorland like a Gothic fantasy. Its towers and turrets pierced the sky, while gargoyles leered from the corners. The West Wing was built to Edmund's exact specifications, with one special room at its heart. The workers found it odd, a room with no windows, walls twice the normal thickness, a single door hidden behind what would become oak paneling. But they were paid not to ask questions, and the foreman, Mr. Bradley, made sure they didn't. The room was 20 feet by 15 feet, larger than a cell but smaller than a proper bedroom. The walls were lined with thick horsehair padding, covered in green damask fabric that would muffle sound. The floor was reinforced to prevent vibration. A small water closet was attached, along with a bathing area. Ventilation was provided through a complex system of pipes that would prevent any sound from escaping while allowing fresh air to circulate. The entrance was a masterpiece of concealment. The oak paneling in the corridor looked seamless, but one section could be pressed to reveal the hidden door. Only someone who knew exactly where to push would find it. Dr. Hartwell provided specifications for special features. Iron rings were embedded in the walls at strategic points. For medical equipment, he assured the workers. A small observation panel was built into the door, covered by a sliding piece of wood. The lock was Swiss-made, virtually unpickable, with only 3 keys created. As the room neared completion, Edmund would sometimes stand inside it, testing the acoustics. A person could scream in that room, and someone standing in the corridor outside would hear nothing. It was perfect. Margaret visited the construction site only once. She walked through the rising structure in silence, her face a mask. When she reached the special room, she stood in the doorway for a long moment. "Will she have light?" she asked finally. Edmund showed her the gas fixtures that would be controlled from outside the room. "She'll have everything she needs." Margaret said nothing more, but that night Sarah found her in Isabel's current room, holding her daughter's hand while she slept. The transfer took place on a September night in 1894, when Thornfield Hall was finally complete. Edmund had planned it with military precision. The servants at the old house were given the night off, save for the trusted inner circle. A private carriage waited in the drive, its windows covered with black cloth. Dr. Hartwell had administered a strong sedative to Isabel that afternoon. She lay unconscious as Thomas and old George carried her wrapped form to the carriage. Margaret followed, clutching a small valise containing her daughter's most precious possessions, a music box from her childhood, a book of pressed flowers, a photograph of the family taken in happier times. The journey across the dark moors took less than an hour, but it felt eternal. Margaret sat beside her sleeping daughter, occasionally reaching out to smooth her hair or adjust the blankets. Edmund rode outside with the driver, scanning the empty landscape for any witnesses. At Thornfield Hall, everything was ready. The special room had been furnished with pieces from Isabel's old chamber, her bed with its brass fittings, her writing desk, her bookshelf filled with her favorite volumes. Sarah had arranged everything exactly as it had been at Whitmore Lodge, hoping familiar surroundings might provide some comfort. They laid Isabel on the bed, still deep in her drugged sleep. Dr. Hartwell checked her pulse and breathing, pronouncing her stable. Then, one by one, they filed out of the room. Edmund was the last to leave, pausing at the concealed door. "It's for the best," Dr. Hartwell said quietly. "In an asylum, she would be just another patient. Here, she'll have privacy, dignity, and the best care money can provide." Edmund nodded and sealed the door. Isabel woke to green walls and silence. For the first few days, she raged against her confinement, throwing herself against the padded walls, screaming until her voice gave out. The servants could hear nothing, but they knew. They saw the torn fabric when they entered to clean, the overturned furniture, the food trays returned untouched. Dr. Hartwell visited twice a week, adjusting her medications, checking her physical health. He kept meticulous records in a private journal, documenting her moods, her delusions, her brief periods of clarity. He experimented with different treatments, laudanum for the violent episodes, chloral hydrate for sleep, various tonics and compounds that promised to restore balance to the troubled mind. Gradually, a routine emerged. Isabel would be calm for days at a time, reading her books, writing in her journal, even doing needlework. Sarah would find elaborate embroideries depicting strange scenes, gardens where the flowers had eyes, birds with human faces, abstract patterns that hurt to look at for too long. During these calm periods, Isabel would converse almost normally with her caregivers. She would ask Thomas about the outside world, request specific books from the library, discuss the plots of novels with Sarah. She seemed to accept her confinement, even expressing gratitude for the quiet room where the voices couldn't find her. But the calm never lasted. Something would trigger a dissent, a sound only she could hear, a shadow that shouldn't exist, a conviction that insects were crawling beneath her skin. She would tear at the walls, convinced that if she could just break through, she could escape the demons pursuing her. She would write frantic messages on any available surface, symbols and words in languages she had never learned. The worst episodes came at night. Isabel would sing, haunting melodies that seemed to come from somewhere else, songs in minor keys that made the servants cross themselves. Sometimes she would hold conversations with invisible visitors, her voice changing as she played different parts. Other nights she would simply scream, not in fear or anger, but in what sounded like profound grief, as if mourning losses too great for words. Margaret visited once a week, always accompanied by Edmund or Dr. Hartwell. These visits followed a strict protocol. Isabel would be sedated beforehand, just enough to ensure docility. Margaret would sit beside the bed holding her daughter's hand, speaking of innocuous things, the garden, the weather, news from distant relatives. Isabel would respond in monosyllables, her eyes focused on something beyond the green walls. After each visit, Margaret would retreat to her private chambers and weep. Edmund would find her there, offer awkward comfort, remind her of the alternatives. What else could they do? The asylums would be worse. This way, Isabel was safe, cared for, protected from the world's cruel judgment. It was an act of love, he insisted. The truest love. The kind that sacrificed reputation for the beloved's well-being. Margaret wanted to believe him. Some days, she almost did. The burden of secrecy wore differently on each member of the household staff who knew the truth. They developed their own ways of coping with the weight of what they witnessed daily. Thomas, the second footman, took to walking the moors in his free time, needing the wild openness to counteract the suffocating secret of the hidden room. He would stand on the ridges overlooking Thornfield Hall, watching the sunset paint the mansion's towers gold, and wonder if houses could absorb the suffering within them. His own sister Mary had been taken to an asylum in Leeds 5 years prior. He'd visited once and vowed never to return. At least Miss Isabel had privacy, he told himself. At least she wasn't displayed like an animal in a menagerie of the mad. Sarah found solace in small acts of kindness. She would bring fresh flowers from the garden, arranging them carefully in the crystal vase on Isabel's mantel. She learned which books brought calm, poetry by Wordsworth, novels by Jane Austen, and which triggered agitation. She developed a gentle way of speaking that could sometimes pull Isabel back from the edge of an episode. On good days, Isabel would call her by name and thank her for the flowers. On bad days, she would accuse Sarah of being an imposter, a demon wearing Sarah's face. Mrs. Davies maintained order through routine. Every detail of Isabel's care was documented in a private ledger, meals served, medications administered, behavioral observations. She created a system of subtle signals so the initiated staff could communicate about Isabel's condition without speaking. A white handkerchief in her pocket meant a calm day. A black one warned of trouble. 2 meant Dr. Hartwell was needed urgently. Old George tended the grounds with extra care around the west wing, though he never looked up at the blank wall where a window should have been. He planted night-blooming jasmine beneath that section, its heavy perfume masking any odors that might escape through the ventilation system. Sometimes, while trimming the hedges, he would hear the faint sound of singing carried on the wind. He would work faster then, humming tavern songs to drown it out. The uninitiated servants developed their own folklore around the mysteries of Thornfield Hall. The housemaids whispered about a ghost in the west wing, the spirit of a broken-hearted lady who had died of grief. The stable boys claimed to see lights moving behind walls where no rooms should be. The cook's assistant swore she heard piano music some nights, though there was no piano in that part of the house. Mrs. Davies dealt harshly with such talk when she encountered it, but she couldn't stamp it out entirely. The stories grew and mutated, feeding on fragments of truth and fertile imagination. Some said the master had murdered his first wife, Anhert. Ghost haunted the halls. Others claimed a mad relative was kept chained in the cellars. The truth, had they known it, was both more mundane and more terrible than any Gothic fantasy. One young maid, Lucy, came closest to discovering the secret. She had been cleaning in the west wing corridor when she noticed an irregularity in the wood paneling, a section that seemed to have been handled more than the rest, the varnish worn thin by touching. She pressed against it experimentally and felt it give slightly. Before she could investigate further, Mrs. Davies appeared as if from nowhere, fixing her with a steely gaze. "That paneling is delicate, Lucy. Very old and very expensive. I trust you'll be more careful in future." Lucy stammered an apology and fled. She was assigned to the East Wing after that and never worked alone in the West Wing again. But sometimes she would stare at the ceiling of her attic room and wonder what lay behind that worn section of wood. Dr. Hartwell's twice-weekly visits to Thornfield Hall followed a precise ritual. He would arrive at 10 in the morning, his black medical bag in hand, his face composed in professional lines. Mrs. Davies would meet him at the servants' entrance. He never used the main door to avoid questions from visiting gentry, and escort him through the back corridors to the west wing. At the concealed door, they would pause. Mrs. Davies would knock in a specific pattern, 2 short, 3 long, 1 short, a signal to Isabel that the doctor was coming. Sometimes this warning helped, sometimes it made things worse. The doctor kept detailed notes of each visit, written in a private shorthand he had developed during his medical training. These records, discovered years later, would provide the most complete picture of Isabel's condition and the treatments attempted. October 3, 1894. Patient lucid upon entry. Engaged in discussion of recent reading, Tennyson's In Memoriam. Expressed understanding of her situation, claims to prefer the quiet room to alternatives. Physical examination shows weight loss continuing despite adequate nutrition. Increased laudanum dosage to address night terrors. October 17, 1894. Severe episode ongoing. Patient believes she is made of glass, refuses to move for fear of shattering. Multiple lacerations on arms from apparent attempt to let the bad blood out. Administered morphine. Suggested to Mr. Whitmore that restraints may become necessary. November 8, 1894. Catatonic state persisting for 3rd day. Patient responds to no stimuli. Force feeding required. Eyes track movement but show no recognition. Mrs. Whitmore's visit postponed. December 1, 1894. Remarkable improvement. Patient playing chess against herself, demonstrating complex strategic thinking. Requested materials for painting. When asked about her episodes, claims no memory of them. "It's as if I sleep and someone else wakes," she said. Approved art supplies with supervision. The painting request marked a new phase in Isabel's confinement. Dr. Hartwell, always searching for therapeutic approaches, had read of artistic expression as a treatment for melancholy and nervous disorders. Edmund, desperate for any sign of improvement, immediately procured the finest watercolors and canvases. What Isabel created with these materials disturbed everyone who saw them. Her paintings showed impossible architectures, rooms that folded in on themselves, staircases that led nowhere, corridors that seemed to breathe. She painted portraits where the faces were assembled from household objects, landscapes where the sky and earth switched places. Most unsettling were her self-portraits, which showed her face fragmenting like a broken mirror, each shard reflecting a different expression. Yet the painting seemed to calm her. For weeks at a time, she would work with intense concentration, barely speaking to her caregivers, eating mechanically, while her eyes remained fixed on some internal vision she struggled to capture. The violent episodes decreased in frequency, if not in intensity. Dr. Hartwell began to wonder if madness might be not a disease, but a different way of perceiving reality. In his private journals, separate from his medical notes, he wrote, "What if Miss Whitmore sees truly, and we are the blind ones? Her paintings reveal architectures of the mind that follow their own logic. When she speaks of voices in the walls, perhaps she hears the echoes of all who have suffered in silence. When she claims the mirrors show false faces, perhaps she perceives the masks we all wear. Is madness the illness, or is it the cure for a world too terrible to perceive with clarity?" These were dangerous thoughts for a man of science. He never shared them with Edmund, who wanted only reports of symptoms and treatments, progress and setbacks measured in quantifiable terms. As 1895 dawned, Thornfield Hall settled into its role as both mansion and asylum. The Whitmores had successfully established their fiction. As far as society knew, Isabel was recovering in Switzerland, making slow but steady progress. Margaret had even arranged for letters to be sent from Geneva, written by a discreet service that specialized in such deceptions. They contained bland updates on mountain air and therapeutic treatments. The great house filled with guests that spring. Edmund's business associates came for shooting parties. Margaret hosted elaborate dinners for the county elite. The West Wing was simply another part of the mansion, its corridors hung with unremarkable paintings, its doors leading to perfectly ordinary rooms. Nobody questioned why certain servants were the only ones who cleaned that section, or why the master's study contained architectural drawings that didn't quite match the visible structure. But houses have a way of absorbing the emotions of their inhabitants. Sensitive guests reported uneasy feelings in the West Wing, though they couldn't articulate why. Dogs, brought for hunting, would whine and refuse to enter certain corridors. Children visiting with their parents would claim to hear someone crying, though their nurses heard nothing. In her hidden room, Isabel entered what Dr. Hartwell termed her year of silence. She stopped speaking entirely in February of 1895, communicating only through written notes when absolutely necessary. She would sit for hours at her window, or rather, where a window should have been, staring at the green damask as if she could see through it to the moors beyond. Her paintings during this period became increasingly abstract, swirls of color that seemed to move when viewed peripherally, geometric patterns that induced vertigo. She worked with desperate intensity, producing dozens of canvases that she would then methodically destroy, tearing them into precise strips and weaving them into new configurations. Sarah found these woven pieces especially disturbing. They seemed to tell stories, fragments of images that almost, but not quite, resolved into recognizable scenes. A piece of blue that might be sky or water or a dress, a streak of red that suggested violence or sunset or roses, brown lines that could be branches or reaching hands or iron bars. The silence extended beyond speech. Isabel moved with extraordinary quiet, seeming to glide across the floor. She would appear suddenly beside Sarah or Thomas, having approached without a sound, and touch their arms gently before retreating to her corner. These touches left the servants unsettled for hours, as if she had transmitted something through the contact that words couldn't convey. Margaret's weekly visits became ordeals of unspoken communication. She would sit beside her silent daughter, holding one-sided conversations about household matters, social events, anything to fill the terrible quiet. Sometimes Isabel would take her mother's hand and trace letters on her palm, but they were in no alphabet Margaret recognized, symbols that felt ancient and urgent and incomprehensible. Only once did Isabel break her silence that year. On Christmas Eve, as Sarah was preparing to leave after bringing a special dinner that would go uneaten, Isabel spoke a single word: soon. Sarah fled the room and didn't return for 3 days. Dr. Hartwell's notes from early 1896 chronicle a marked deterioration in Isabel's condition. The silence had given way to a new phase, one of preparation. Isabel began giving away her possessions, pressing books into Sarah's hands, leaving small wrapped parcels for Thomas, even attempting to gift her paintings to Dr. Hartwell, who declined them with professional detachment. January 15, 1896, patient exhibiting signs of terminal lucidity. Speaking again, but only of departure. Claims to be packing for a long journey. Physical health declining rapidly despite adequate nutrition. Pulse irregular. Refuses all medications. February 2, 1896. Patient requested visit from parents together. First such request in 6 months. Recommend approval despite risks. Maybe final opportunity for proper farewell. The last family meeting took place on February 5th, 1896. Edmund and Margaret entered the hidden room together, finding Isabel sitting calmly at her desk, dressed in her best gown, one she had somehow preserved through years of episodes and violence. She looked for a moment like the daughter they remembered. "Mother, father," her voice was clear, cultured, entirely sane. "I wanted to thank you for the room. It's been exactly what I needed." Margaret broke down crying. Edmund stood frozen, uncertain how to respond to this echo of his real daughter. "I know what you've sacrificed," Isabel continued. "Your reputation, your peace, your hearts. I know what it cost to love me through this. I want you to know that I understand, and I forgive you." She stood then, moved to embrace her mother, who clung to her desperately. She even allowed her father to take her hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. "The walls are getting thin," she said, stepping back. "I can almost see through them now. There's so much light on the other side. Don't grieve when I go through. I'll finally be free." Those were her last coherent words. 3 days later, Sarah entered with the morning tray to find Isabel dead in her bed, her face peaceful, her hands folded over a last painting, a simple watercolor of an open door with brilliant light streaming through. Isabel's death was never officially recorded. Dr. Hartwell signed no certificate. No funeral was held. In the dead of night, Edmund and his most trusted servants buried her in an unmarked grave on the moor, far from consecrated ground. The hidden room was sealed, its concealed door locked and the key destroyed. Edmund ordered that section of the house closed, the furniture covered, the corridors abandoned to dust and silence. For 10 years, the secret held. The Whitmores maintained their fiction, gradually allowing society to forget about their mysterious daughter. They never had other children. Margaret withdrew increasingly into herself, spending her days in prayer and charity work, as if trying to atone for unnamed sins. Edmund threw himself into business with renewed fervor, building his empire ever larger, as if prosperity could fill the void left by Isabel's absence. The servants who knew the truth took the secret to their graves. Mrs. Davies retired to a cottage by the sea, living on a generous pension that bought her silence. Thomas emigrated to America, carrying memories that haunted him across an ocean. Sarah married a farmer and never worked in service again, though she kept one of Isabel's paintings hidden in her attic, an abstract piece that seemed to show a figure breaking free from geometric constraints. Old George lasted the longest at Thornfield Hall, tending the grounds until his death in 1905. In his final delirium, he spoke of "The Lady in the Walls" and "Songs from Sewell" behind the green, but the nurse attributed it to fever and gave it no credence. Edmund died in 1906, collapsing at his desk while reviewing production figures from his factories. Margaret survived him by only 6 months, fading away like a ghost herself. With no heirs, Thornfield Hall and the Whitmore fortune passed to distant cousins who had no knowledge of the family's hidden shame. The new owners, the Fairfaxes, arrived in 1907 to find a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. They immediately set about renovating, determined to brighten the oppressive atmosphere. It was during this renovation that the truth finally came to light. Workers demolishing a wall in the west wing to expand a drawing room broke through into a space that shouldn't have existed. The foreman, a practical man named William Harper, was the first to enter the hidden room. His report, given to the local constabulary and preserved in police records, provides our clearest picture of what was found. The room was like stepping into the past, everything covered in dust but otherwise untouched, a bed with iron fixtures, the mattress rotted through, books scattered about, pages yellow with age. The walls were covered in fabric, but underneath you could see marks like someone had clawed at them. There were paintings everywhere, strange things that hurt to look at. And in the corner, a trunk full of women's clothing from maybe 20 years past. The smell, it wasn't death exactly, but something else, like sorrow itself had soaked into the walls. The discovery caused a sensation. The local newspapers ran breathless accounts of the secret room of Thornfield Hall and the hidden tragedy of the Whitmore family. Reporters interviewed former servants, most of whom claimed ignorance, though a few hinted at rumors they'd heard but never believed. The story grew in the telling. Some claimed to have found chains and shackles, others spoke of bloodstains and scratched messages of despair. The Fairfaxes, horrified by their discovery and the attention it brought, tried to contain the scandal. They had the room professionally cleaned and converted it into a storage area. The paintings were burned, all except a few that a visiting artist claimed had extraordinary psychological significance and purchased for study. The books and personal effects were donated to charity, dispersing the last physical traces of Isabel Whitmore. But some things cannot be so easily erased. The servants hired by the Fairfaxes reported strange occurrences in the West Wing. Doors that opened by themselves, the sound of watercolors dropping onto paper in empty rooms, a woman's voice singing lullabies that no living person remembered. The pragmatic Fairfaxes dismissed such talk, but they never used that section of the house for guests. The tragedy of Isabel Whitmore was far from unique in Victorian England. The treatment of mental illness in the 19th century was barbaric by modern standards, characterized by ignorance, fear, and social stigma. Wealthy families faced an impossible choice when confronted with a family member suffering from mental illness: commit them to asylums that were little better than prisons, or hide them away in private arrangements that skirted the law. The Victorian concept of madness was particularly cruel to women. Female hysteria was a catch-all diagnosis for any behavior that deviated from narrow social norms. Intelligence, creativity, sexual desire, political opinions, all could be symptoms of a diseased mind requiring treatment. The treatments themselves were often torturous: cold water baths, restraints, isolation, drugs that caused more harm than healing. Private confinement, like Isabel experienced, was common among the upper classes. These hidden family members were erased from public record, their very existence denied to maintain the family's social standing. Census records from the period show discrepancies that historians now recognize as evidence of these missing relatives. How many Isabels were there, locked away in hidden rooms across England? We'll never know the true number. The architecture of concealment became an actual specialty among certain builders and architects. Hidden rooms, secret passages, and concealed doors were not just the stuff of Gothic novels, but practical necessities for families guarding dark secrets. Some mansion floor plans from the era show curious gaps and inconsistencies that suggest spaces deliberately omitted from official records. Medical understanding of mental illness in the 1890s was primitive. Doctors like Hartwell were working with theories that mixed medieval superstition with early scientific observation. The idea that madness might be hereditary led to additional stigma. If one family member was afflicted, it cast doubt on the mental stability of all their relations, affecting marriage prospects and social standing for generations. The medications available were crude and dangerous. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was prescribed for everything from headaches to psychosis. Chloral hydrate, one of the first synthetic sedatives, could be fatal in doses only slightly higher than therapeutic. Mercury, arsenic, and other poisons were used in attempts to rebalance the disturbed mind. Many patients died not from their illness, but from their treatment. The story of Thornfield Hall didn't end with the discovery of the hidden room. The mansion developed a reputation that made it difficult to sell or rent. The Fairfaxes abandoned it in 1910, unable to shake the feeling of being watched in their own home. For 5 years it stood empty, slowly being claimed by the moorland weather and creeping vines. In 1915, with England deep in the Great War, Thornfield Hall was requisitioned as a convalescent home for wounded soldiers. The men who recovered there reported strange experiences, comforting presences in the night, a woman's voice singing them to sleep, gentle touches from invisible hands. Unlike the former residents, the soldiers didn't find these occurrences frightening. Some claimed the mysterious presence understood their trauma in ways the living couldn't. One soldier, Captain James Morrison, kept a diary of his recovery at Thornfield. His entry from November 1917 reads, "The men have taken to calling her the Lady of Thornfield. She comes when the nightmares are worst, bringing peace I haven't felt since before the Somme. Thompson swears he saw her once, a young woman in old-fashioned dress standing by his bed with such sadness in her eyes. But a kind sadness, if that makes sense, like she knew about being trapped in your own mind, fighting battles nobody else can see. We don't tell the nurses. They wouldn't understand. But she's more real to us than their pills and therapies. She knows what it's like to be buried alive." After the war, Thornfield Hall served various purposes: a school, a hotel, even briefly as an artists' commune in the 1960s. Each incarnation brought new stories of the mysterious presence in the West Wing. The artists, particularly, claimed inspiration from the Muse of Thornfield, producing works that echoed the disturbing brilliance of Isabel's paintings. In 1975, during another renovation, workers discovered a cache of documents hidden beneath floorboards in what had been Edmund's study. Among them were Dr. Hartwell's complete medical notes, Margaret's private diary, and, most remarkably, pages from Isabel's own journal that must have been smuggled out of the hidden room. These documents transformed understanding of the Whitmore tragedy. Isabel's writings revealed a brilliant mind struggling with what modern psychiatrists might diagnose as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Her descriptions of her internal experience were poetic, terrifying, and deeply moving. The walls speak in colors I have no names for. Time moves sideways here, and I am every age I've ever been all at once. Yesterday, I was 5 and watching butterflies in the garden while simultaneously being 90 and dying in a bed I'll never reach. The voices aren't outside my head. They're more real than that. They're the thoughts the house thinks, the dreams the stones dream. Father believes I'm broken. But what if I'm just tuned to a different frequency? What if madness is simply seeing too much truth for a single mind to hold? Margaret's diary revealed a mother's anguish in heartbreaking detail. She knew me today. For 5 minutes, my Isabel was there, trapped behind eyes that usually look through me. She said, "I'm sorry, Mama, for being too much." How do I tell her she was never too much, that it's the world that's too small, too cruel, too afraid of anything it cannot categorize and control? We've made her prison as gentle as we can, but a silk-lined cage is still a cage. Sometimes I think we're all imprisoned, she in her room, Edmund in his inability to accept imperfection, and I in my complicity. But what else could we do? What else could we do? In the 1980s, Thornfield Hall was purchased by the National Trust and opened to the public as a historical site. The hidden room was restored to approximate its appearance during Isabel's confinement, based on the discovered documents and archaeological evidence. Visitors report it as the most emotionally affecting part of the tour. Paranormal investigators have made Thornfield a regular stop, recording numerous anomalies in the West Wing: electromagnetic fluctuations, temperature drops, audio recordings of unexplained sounds. Skeptics attribute these to the power of suggestion and the natural acoustics of old buildings. But even skeptics admit to an oppressive atmosphere in the hidden room, a weight of accumulated sorrow that seems to press against the green walls. In 2010, a descendant of Sarah, the housemaid, donated the painting she had kept hidden for over a century. Art historians were astounded by its sophistication and emotional power. The abstract piece seemed to shift and change depending on viewing angle and lighting, creating an effect that contemporary artists struggle to replicate. It now hangs in the Tate Modern, labeled simply Untitled, The Door, Isabel Whitmore, c. 1895. Psychiatric historians have used the Whitmore case to illustrate the evolution of mental health treatment. Dr. Elizabeth Manning, who wrote the definitive study, observed. Isabel Whitmore represents thousands of forgotten individuals who suffered not just from mental illness, but from society's response to it. The Whitmores genuinely believed they were protecting their daughter, showing more compassion than many families of their time. Yet their solution, lifelong solitary confinement, reveals the terrible inadequacy of private charity when systematic medical understanding is lacking. Isabel's paintings and writings suggest a creative genius that with proper treatment might have flourished. Instead, her gifts were buried with her in an unmarked grave. How many potential artists, writers, and thinkers have we lost to fear and misunderstanding? Visitors to Thornfield Hall can still see the hidden room, though they're not allowed to enter. They peer through a glass partition installed to protect the historical space, seeing the restored furnishings, reproductions of Isabel's paintings, and the green damask walls that witnessed years of secret suffering. The most affecting element is a simple placard that reads, Isabel Whitmore, 1874-1896, lived in this room from 1894 until her death. She was never officially declared dead, never buried in consecrated ground, never mourned publicly by her family. This room stands as a memorial to all who have been hidden away, declared too difficult, too different, too much for their time. May we remember them, and may we do better. Tour guides report that visitors often leave flowers at the door, despite signs requesting they don't. The flowers appear particularly on February 5th, the anniversary of Isabel's death. Nobody knows who started this tradition, but it continues year after year. The current estate manager, David Ashworth, has worked at Thornfield for 20 years. He's collected hundreds of visitor accounts of unusual experiences in the West Wing. Most involve feelings rather than sightings, sudden overwhelming sadness, the sensation of being watched, an urge to speak words of comfort to empty air. I don't believe in ghosts, Ashworth says, but I believe places can hold memories, especially memories of intense emotion. That room held a human being for 2 years, contained all her fear and rage and sorrow and moments of joy. How could that not leave a mark? When visitors say they feel Isabel's presence, I think they're feeling the weight of history, the echo of injustice. And maybe that's what ghosts really are, not spirits, but reminders that people lived and suffered and deserve to be remembered. The Victorian mansion at Thornfield Hall hid its horrific secret for more than a decade, but secrets have a way of revealing themselves. The story of Isabel Whitmore forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how society treats those who don't fit its narrow definitions of normalcy. The Whitmores weren't monsters. They were people of their time, trapped by social expectations and limited medical knowledge, trying to navigate an impossible situation. Their solution, hiding Isabel away, came from a mixture of love, shame, and desperation that many families of the era would have understood. The true horror lies not in individual cruelty, but in a system that made such concealment seem like the kindest option. Modern visitors to Thornfield Hall often ask whether the house is haunted. The answer depends on how you define haunting. If ghosts are the spirits of the dead lingering in places of trauma, then perhaps Isabel still wanders the West Wing, singing her strange songs and painting her impossible visions. But if haunting means being unable to forget the injustices of the past, then we are all haunted by Isabel Whitmore and the countless others like her. The hidden room remains a powerful symbol of family secrets, societal shame, the price of conformity, and the human cost of maintaining appearances. It reminds us that the most terrifying prisons are often built with the best intentions, that love can become a cage, and that the greatest horror might be not in what families hide, but in what they're willing to sacrifice to hide it. Thornfield Hall still stands on the Yorkshire moors, its towers reaching toward sky that Isabel could only imagine from her windowless room. Visitors come seeking ghosts and find something more unsettling, a mirror reflecting our own capacity for creating horror in the name of protection, for building walls that imprison those we claim to love. The mansion hid its secret for years, but perhaps the real secret was never Isabel's existence. Perhaps it was the truth that every family, every society has its hidden rooms, spaces where we lock away what doesn't fit what challenges us, what reminds us of our own fragility. The Victorian mansion's horrific secret was not that it contained a mad daughter, but that it revealed the madness of a world that could imagine no better solution than hiding her away. In the end, Thornfield Hall's true ghost is not a spectral woman in Victorian dress, but the haunting question that echoes through its corridors. How many Isabels are hidden still, in rooms both literal and metaphorical, waiting for someone to find the concealed door and let in the light? Thank you for watching Old Family Drama. If you'd like more forgotten stories from history's darkest estates, let me know which mansion we should explore next.